Okay, so this is where we left off in class. I'm just going to pick up from here and get this to a state where it's finished enough to be an underpainting, to serve as an underpainting. And for an underpainting, what you want is for it serves two purposes, basically, for me, and maybe more. It serves to lock down those value relationships that are so important with a painting, and it gives you that underlying structure of composition that's going to pull the whole thing together, regardless of the details that you add to it later on. The details can be really icing on the cake, but if that underlying structure speaks for itself without any kind of detail added to it, then that's really in the position you want to be in before you start adding those great details in. Okay, so this is my palette as I left it. Here is my sort of a sienna brown. It's still a little bit on the red side, as you can see when it's thinned out with the white on the paper. I think you can probably see that, although this is not the ideal video setup here. So I have to move everything around on my desktop, a virtual desktop, so that I can see the image that I'm working from. There we go. All right. Now you can't see that. I'm going to try to superimpose that image over this video so that if and when you watch this, you can actually see what I'm seeing. All right, so I'm going to treat that big chunk of trees back here as one comprehensive shape, because that's really the way it's going to read. Remember that I'm going to be painting over all of this later on. Now, all I can do is go as dark as I can with the value that I've mixed, remembering that later on, I may actually end up darkening that a little bit, but you know what I'm saying that. I'm going to mix a little bit more of the burnt umber into that just to make it a little bit darker. I don't have black on my palette. I don't use black. I tend to not use black. Every once in a while, I'll throw some in there. But even black from a tube has pigments in it. So it won't be a totally flat black. But one of the reasons I don't like to use black is because it does tend to give a flatter look than if you mix a color that is as dark as you want it to be. That is actually closer to sienna brown now that it's got more of the burnt umber in there. Okay, remember that for big swatches of color, you do want to mix with your palette knife because it's so much easier and avoids that deep cleaning that you have to do once you get the paint worked up into the ferrule of the brush. It's really hard to clean well. And even though you might think that you cleaned it well, later on you'll end up with a stiffness in it because that paint deep inside has dried out. And there's really no way to get that out of there without soaking it with super harsh chemicals, which you really don't want around. All right, back to this. I guess I should have left some of that other value to do that part back there. I had a rag here somewhere. I'm just using my paper towels. I like to have rags handy also, so that I'm not just disposing of paper towels. So I'm going to do for that background part where there are trees in the distance, but they're not quite as contrasty as the ones in the foreground. So I'm going to get that in there over here. Sort of ignoring that little bit of land that's behind that stand of trees there. Okay, then go back in with this darker tone here with the addition of that burnt umber. And just block that in with that whole tone. Worry about the details later in terms of you can actually distinguish some of the forms of the trees. Okay, and I really like the shape of this brush because on its side, I can block in those tree shapes pretty easily. Now, for something like this, the rhythm of that tree line is really up to you, and you can establish whatever you want to as far as that goes, using the idea of the trees and that they stretch across and combine to form that really nice dark value. I'm going to let that sort of dwindle down to shorter ones as it actually does in the image itself. If I can, I find that I keep going taller than I'm intending to. And that is just because of the brush that I'm using. And it doesn't matter a whole lot, because like I said, eventually I'm actually going to go over this, the color tones that I want. This is obviously this is too red brown to capture this painting, but ruckus in the background. There's always ruckus in the background here, so there's really no avoiding it. unless I were going to get up and do this at 2 a.m. And that would be problematic for other reasons. One, I would not be coherent. Two, the light would be really different. I like to use natural daylight, at least a little bit, doing something like this. If you are stuck in a situation where you are working in a basement or some other situation with lack of natural lighting, there are ways that you can compensate for it. And that has to do with the kind of lighting that you're using, the bulbs, etc. Just do the best you can with what you have. Okay, so that tree line reads pretty well right now. And what I have to do is now work my way into the foreground. Again, just thinking about value. So that value that I already put down, that sort of light pinkish sort of color right back here, that works pretty well for what I want. Just looking at my photo that's right next to you, can't see it right now, but hopefully, well, maybe you can see it right now, because if you're listening to this, hopefully it's a finished video. The value of that land that's right in front of the tree right here is, I'm gonna use my own little, oh, this is not my trick, this is a trick I got from someone else, another painter. All right, so that land is slightly darker. Interesting. Okay, so what is right here is actually slightly darker in the photo than what is back here. Again, this part is so deceptive because your eyes perceive those big forms, but they're actually not that dark because of atmospheric perspective. So the more air that's between you and something in the background, the less color, the less contrast, the less detail it has. And that's what's happening here. That background really doesn't have a whole lot of contrast. So let's see. I'm just gonna leave this the way it is right now. Do some minor adjustments later on. All right, so I'm gonna work my way back, or forward, sorry. Work my way forward towards where the water is. Now the water cuts pretty much right through the middle, but because there's a nice diagonal coming up through here, I feel like that compensates for that. I would not normally put a really big division like that directly across the center because it tends to cut a picture in half in that dimension. But because of this diagonal that's gonna be coming through like that, I'm gonna rely on that. Okay, so to determine what value the water has, as opposed to the sky, let's say, I'm going to use that little piece of paper with the tiny dot in it. So it's more saturated than the sky. It's also just 1 or 2 tones darker than the sky. And the part of the sky that I'm looking at is basically right in the center right here. So. All right, speeding things up a little bit to save everyone some time. You can see that what I'm doing here is adding a lot of white to this area right here. And I'm using that as kind of a medium, almost as I would use a medium, to thin out that sienna brown so that I have that lighter value to it. But I also want to really get the thickness of the paint in there. I don't want to see the texture of the paper showing through. So I'm mixing that with lots and lots of white. There's not very much pigment. I would say in terms of ratio, probably almost 10 parts white to 1 part of the sienna brown. I wanted that to be a really, really light value. And after blocking that in, and I tried to go down far enough so that it would encompass the whole area that's going to be covered by that promontory of land that angles back towards the pine trees on the lower right-hand side. And I think I did that. I think I had to do a little bit of messing around with it later on. And now going to that distant middle ground to just kind of block in a few shapes before I work my way into the foreground. Remember that that's a good protocol for working. It's not absolute. Again, there are almost no absolutes in painting, except that you need paint. But other than that, there's not a whole lot of absolutes. Generally speaking, background to foreground will serve you well because then you can go on top of the stuff that's in your background and not have to worry about edges and going back to clarify edges at some point, which is really fussy work and not satisfying. So you want to work into your, increasingly into your foreground. Now here, that closer part of the middle ground, I had to think about quite a bit to figure out what I wanted to get from that. It's close enough where those trees would start to stand out as individual forms if I allow them to. It's also far enough away where I could clump things together and have them read a certain way. So it's sort of to manipulate how I want the forms to read, what kind of contrast I want in that area, and how I want things to combine together visually. So you can see that I drew that dark line underneath where the trees are right next to the water. In the reference photo, which you can see up in the right-hand side, you can see that there actually is that dark line underneath those trees. That's the shadow they're casting into the water. I've exaggerated it a little bit. One,
because it just was easier to do it that way with the brush I was using. And two, because visually now it's going to tie together all of those trees that are resting along that point. I also, and you can see I used just a light, medium, and dark value to start to get the form of those trees in there and to sketch out the contrast. Those are going to be a little bit more contrasty when the painting is finished, but right now they're reading pretty much the way I want them to read. So working into the foreground now, kind of trying to establish that rounded feel of that land promontory coming at us. There's a shadow on the right hand side. Then it gets brighter, that strip along the middle. Then there's all that really fun brushwork with the grasses on the left hand side that's coming up too. But first I wanted to capture what the nature of the ground kind of looked like. And again, referencing the reference photo, you can see that there's some big rocks, like chunks of rocks there. It's sandy. I'm not going to try to get the sandy texture in there with an underpainting. That's going to come later, if at all. But I did want to get some of those rocks in there to just kind of capture the nature of the ground that I'm trying to describe. So you can see that shadow on the lower right. I'm happier with this one than I was in the original painting, but I minimized it. And I think that's why I'm happier with it, because it's not really what the foreground is about. The foreground is about those chunks of grass. Compositionally speaking, that kind of thing is really easy to manipulate. Think about that when you're doing things like trees and mountains. You can move all that stuff around. Not so much with a portrait, right? Because then you get cubism. If you don't want it, then it's not satisfying. But with a landscape, those elements are super easy and plastic to put where you need them to be. So remember that as you're working, right? You don't have to reproduce a photo. We already have the photo. So why make another one? You're making a painting. Here, working on those background grasses that are going to sit nicely behind those big clumps, but they're almost all going to be covered up, but it's important to have them there. And there you can see I had to go back and fix that little blob of dark sienna that I put on the left side of the page by accident. Going back to fix those grasses again. And then I get to jump into the foreground and place those big chunks of grass where I want them to be. Looking at the individuality of the different chunks just so it doesn't start to feel like a cookie cutter template kind of thing. But, giving them enough individuality, but then moving them, doing more if I want to do more, placing them where I want them to be to really solidly lock in that attention to the foreground. I didn't go in and do the lighter value in the underpainting because it would have blended in too much with the lake. So I'm going to leave that for later, and this is just about finished, and soon you're going to see just the image of the underpainting flash onto the screen. So we're going to kind of wind down here, just doing a little bit more blending. When the paint is wet and you can actually blend things together, it's so much more satisfying and feels a little bit more like oil, which, again, I've said this before, is my preference, but here is the finished product. Thank you for listening, and tune in next time for actual work on the finished painting on top of this.